Right, so we're going to get started. So this is week 4 of the introduction to property investment. So there's a total of 12 modules, each like speaking about different things. The previous 3 ones, we had the overall introduction, then we had the one on the buy, renovate, refinance, rent, and repeat strategy. And last week we were talking about rent to rent and rent to serviced accommodation. This week we're going to dig a little bit deeper into buy to let investments, because in reality, let's say a 2, 3, or 4 bedroom mid terraced house, the very standard property that people buy as a buy to let investment. In reality, there are different ways to get income from that. And it's important, like when starting, to actually think that, yes, we can have a family in there or a couple in there or an individual, maybe if it's a small house. But there are, just one moment, there's someone else joining. But there are lots of other ways of getting income from buy-to-let investment management, and some of them also require some adaptations, maybe a bit more investment when we're buying and renovating and getting the property ready for use. So yeah, we're going to be looking at these 5 things. So we got the same house, so we can be using standard tenancies in there. We can be doing serviced accommodation, which means renting the house out on Airbnb, booking.com, looking also for longer term, like medium term bookings, like 2, 3 months from contractors or people moving in to an area for their work. So serviced accommodation. We're going to be talking about mini HMOs and standard HMOs. We'll be focusing probably more on mini HMOs. Mini HMO is up to 4 bedrooms. Mini HMO is a term that we use when we're talking about them. It's not an official government or licensing term. We talk about HMOs, but there is a difference that we will be seeing between mini HMOs up to 4 bedrooms. In reality, it's up to 4 bedrooms and also up to a maximum of 4 people. So that if we've got 4 bedrooms and one of them is big and we put a couple in there, then that makes 5 people, and we're no longer a mini HMO. We're what I'm calling in this presentation standard HMO, because as soon as we're 5 people or more, we're into what's called mandatory licensing. So the standards are the same. We've got the same. I'm going to be talking about this a little bit when we actually get onto the slide, but I'm saying a little bit here so that when we get onto the slide, it'll be almost like a refresher. The standards, like, because when we've got an HMO, we've got higher standards for fire safety. We have to have, even if it's a mini one, we still have to have fire doors properly fitted on all the bedrooms. Kitchen.
It's just past that block. If
Sorry,
you're on, yeah. Okay, man.
Yeah. And yeah, so we got the fire doors.
You can your card. Card, yeah, wait a second.
Sorry, did someone ask a question? I didn't catch that.
I think Nick's unmuted.
Just but... from one side.
If you mute all, Trevor, you can mute everyone.
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, fucking unmuted.
You're gonna have to mute everyone, Trevor. Niggas know where he's on. Okay, there he is.
I think we're okay now. Yeah. everyone is muted. If someone's got a question, maybe put it on the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, so when we're talking about HMOs, the compliance as regards fire safety is the same, but licensing is going to be different. And then the other two uses of our exactly the same house is one is what we call social housing, and the other is what we call supported living. Sometimes people are putting these into the same, basically into the same bag, into the same category, but there is a difference. A common thing on these is that generally social housing and supported living, when we've got the house up to the required standard, we're agreeing a medium to long-term lease with what we call a provider. So when we're on social housing, we'll see in a moment in more detail what that is. We're typically talking about a lease for 3 to 5 years. And when we're supported living, that's 5 years. It could actually be up to 10 years. So we've got all these different possibilities. Just one moment, someone else coming in. Yeah, so we've got these different possibilities. We need to understand, yeah, what are the advantages, disadvantages of each one. So why focus on maximizing income? I think here is that, as we said at the very beginning on the fundamentals, when we're investing in property, there's two things that we're looking for. One is what we call the cash flow. So that's the additional money that we're getting every month from the property once we've paid the mortgage, if we've got one, and when we paid all the expenses, that's cash flow. And we're also looking at the ongoing capital appreciation, so the increase in value of a property over time. So if our goal is, for example, to as fast as possible replace our work income with income from property, then we're going to be thinking of what can we do with the property to get maximum cash flow. If our aim is to buy something, get some income from it, but sort of completely forget about it, then we might be looking for the more long-term strategies like the social housing or the supported living leases. So what are standard tenancies? Standard tenancies are basically someone rents a house and you can and they're there forever. If we're looking at the what's currently happening with the new renters' rights bills, but obviously there are ways of, if people are not paying, there are ways of evicting them, but it's more complicated. And on a landlord point of view, we've got a lot more legislation to make sure that we're following carefully. And either effectively we're self-managing, in which case we have to do all that, be careful of all the legislation, make sure everything's done correctly, or we're using an estate agent to manage the rentals, and there we're relying on the estate agent, obviously using their professional expertise and making sure that all the rules are being followed. So these are traditional tenancies, typically what is called in England currently assured short hold tenancies. In Wales, it's now the occupancy contract. So we're renting to individuals or families. Tenants being responsible for utilities. So the tenants are paying the council tax, paying the utilities, and like basic upkeep, which is like a redecorating or things like that. But as we know, the landlord is responsible for everything else, like working in the house. So the plumbing, if the house is supplied with things like cookers, washing machines, if those break down, it's the owner's responsibility. So advantages here, it's maybe the simplest way of yet on that if the tenant stops paying, we can have a problem. And there are ways of mitigating that. One way is to have 10 or 20 houses, so that if one is not paying, we've got 19 or 9 other ones. If we're starting out and we've got only one buy-to-let, then the way to deal with that is to take out rent guarantee insurance. Because if obviously we're dependent on the money coming in to pay the mortgage and to give us some cash flow, then we've got a real problem if we've only got one property and we've got a tenant who's stopped paying. Also on standard tenancies, the management demands are relatively small. Obviously, this depends on the state of repair of the house. If we're doing like a buy, refurbish and rent project, then generally brought the house up to a good standard. We've made sure everything's in good condition. So we're not expecting to have any major problems over the coming years. If you buy a house that's in poor condition and only do minimal repairs, then we can expect over time to have more demands on the management. Disadvantages of the standard tenancies: relatively low rental yield compared to other strategies. And here I'm specifically comparing with doing serviced accommodation. That obviously assumes that we're in a region or an area where serviced accommodation works well. If we're in some like district where there's no demand for serviced accommodation, then we either be doing standard tenancy or looking at the other options. And also the income, obviously it's market that is driving the rental prices. So we have seen quite reasonable increases in average rent over the last 2-3 years. But obviously there's a limit. You can't just keep on increasing the rent and expect people to pay that. And there's also an issue, sometimes we're talking about that if we're going for absolute maximum rent, we've got the danger of ending up with tenants that are like sort of, okay, say, yes, we think we can afford that, and they'll move in. And then we can end up, soon they realize that it's more than perhaps they able to pay or expecting to pay. And we end up having faster problems than renting at like normal, good market rate. So standard tenancy, I don't think there's that much more to say about them. We can look more at comparisons when we move on. Yeah, but yeah, maybe just one thing to say, standard tenancies, we do have some compliance requirements. So obviously the house has to be, or the flat has to be like fit for purpose, in a good state of repair. But these relatively minimal things as regards fire safety, we have to have just the 2 or 3 interlinked fire alarms, one on the ground floor, one on the landing. We don't have to have smoke alarms in every bedroom, and we have to have the carbon monoxide detectors, and then all the standard things. We have to have proper ventilation, so we're not getting damp in the house. No holes, so we haven't got mice coming in, and all the basically providing a decent house for someone to live in. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is serviced accommodation. And also, whilst we're talking about compliance, in general, if it's a standard house like a 2, 3, 4 bedroom house that we're operating as serviced accommodation, there aren't any additional compliance requirements than there are on a standard house. It's basically the same. There are some things that are like common sense that are not an absolute requirement from a legal point of view, but things like thumb turn locks on the main exit doors, so that if there's a fire, especially if it's serviced accommodation, the house has been locked from the inside. People don't know where they put the key. They need to be able to get out. So basic things like that. But if it's a standard size house, then requirements on serviced accommodation are the same as, well, the same as a standard house. The big difference that if we're doing a standard rental, we can rent unfurnished. We can't rent serviced accommodation unfurnished. We can't put an advert on Airbnb and expect people to turn up with sofa, bed, and everything in their suitcases. So when we're doing serviced accommodation, we haven't got specifically any additional requirements on the renovation. The only thing that we might do, if we know we're going to be operating the house as serviced accommodation, when we're finishing it off, we're going to maybe be doing things to a slightly higher standard. This doesn't mean necessarily putting in a massive extra cost. Like when we're painting, we're going to paint probably some feature walls, which means painting one wall in each room a different color. And if we're like doing the electricity, rather than putting the switches and sockets that cost £1 each, the basic white ones, we might spend £2 on a switch or socket and put some black ones or some chrome ones. Just a few little extra touches to give that house a better look and a feeling of moving somewhere nice. But then, of course, when we're doing serviced accommodation, we have to be fully furnished, and we have to provide all the things, like the kitchen has to have everything in it, cutlery, pots and pans, bedside lights, everything basically that people need to, as if they're moving into a home. But as regards the overall compliance, it's when we're renovating, same as on a standard let. So it's short-term rental model designed to cater to business, travelers, tourists, contractors. So fully furnished properties with everything ready to go. So typically we're getting a higher, considerably higher rental yield compared to standard tenancies. So if we're looking for cash flow and we find a house that's in a good area that works for serviced accommodation, it's a great strategy for getting higher income from the same property. Disadvantages: higher management demands and operational costs. We spoke about this a little last week when we were talking about rent to serviced accommodation. It's not quite so much of an issue when we're buying a house as an investment and we're operating it as serviced accommodation. But there is the fact that if we're having a management company that is looking after the house, then we're going to be paying probably around 15% of the income, what the guests are paying to the management company. So that means our overall income is going to be less, but still likely to be considerably more than on a standard rental. And then the other disadvantage, seasonal fluctuations in occupancy. Depending on where we are, we're likely to have like really high rates in the summer, and quieter months like November, January, February. We might actually end up having less income than on a standard rental. But in summer, it might be twice or three times that income. It is important, if we're looking to go buy properties that can be suitable for serviced accommodation, to consider where they are. Be sure that they're good near good transport links, that there's either touristic demand or demand for contractors. Quite often, serviced accommodation can be useful near major hospitals. So for accommodating medical staff, we do that in some of our properties and it works really well. Maybe at this point, there might be some questions before we go on to the next one, which is talking about HMOs, and then social housing and supported living.
Hey, Trevor. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Fantastic. It wasn't so much a question, but just some information for everyone in the chat and people watching the recording as well, which hopefully might be a bit useful. When I started out, I joined the NRLA, which is National Residential Landlords Association. You do have to pay a membership to get access to what I'm about to describe, but the NRLA provide a checklist for when you're doing a standard buy-to-let. So you can basically put your property on there and it will give you this long checklist of all the things that you need to comply with, when you need to comply with them, when you need to hand the documentation to the tenant, you know, how to serve all of those different components of those regulations. And it's like a sort of about a 40-point checklist that you can do for each property. So I just found that really useful. You do also get 10% off at B&Q on their trade point cards as well with NRLA, so you can actually make the money back on the subscription. I just thought it might be useful for people to know.
Yeah, NRLA is effectively a good thing, and I think also there's discounts on insurance as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they do sort of some other little incentives there.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully it's useful for someone.
Yeah. Any other fast questions? Okay, so we'll move on. Just one thing whilst we have that led me to another thing we were talking about, like insurance and things. Obviously, we need a high level of insurance if we're operating as serviced accommodation. And a key thing as well is which is most likely the case, we've got a mortgage, we're using finance on the property. If we're doing serviced accommodation, we can't start with a buy-to-let, have a buy-to-let mortgage, and then just operate as serviced accommodation. We need to have a lender that is aware and agrees for the property to be used as serviced accommodation. Typically, these are called holiday let mortgages. So we need to be aware of that. And in reality, it's going to be the same thing if it's social housing, supported living, or HMOs. All those require lender approval. And some lenders may be reticent to lend when it's like long contracts, like the leases with the social housing or the supported living, and some may be quite happy with it as well. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. So what are mini HMOs? So a reminder, this mini HMO is a term that I'm using and that other people use. It's not an official term. So we're talking about a house that's got 3 or 4 bedrooms, and in reality, no more than 4 individual tenants. And the other rule is that must be like 2 or more families. So if there's 4 people from the same family, it's not an HMO. If there's as soon as there's 2 families, then it's an HMO. So advantages is we're letting the rooms out individually. We've still got a standard like AST contract, or in Wales an occupancy contract for each individual person, but we've got a higher overall income because we've got the income from all of the rooms. But obviously at the same time, the landlord is paying the council tax, paying the utilities, and yeah, that's it, basic water, gas, electricity, and internet. So generally we talk about mini HMOs because they don't require mandatory licensing. So we're not obliged to get an HMO license. However, if we're in a Article 4 area, then that may require, because Article 4 just means that certain of the national rules have been restricted. It could be restricted on planning, it could be restricted on licensing. So there are areas that even if it's a mini HMO, it might require licensing. So if you're buying a property thinking of operating it as a mini HMO, check the licensing rules. That doesn't mean to say you can't do it, but it means you have to apply and get a license. And there's also, we're not going to go into all the details of that. There's also the question of planning. If we are in England, we can operate an HMO if it was under permitted development. If we're in Wales, we have to unfortunately go through planning and have a change of use from C3 to C4. And then the other thing like is here, it's under the disadvantages. We have to be compliant with all the safety standards, which means properly fitted fire doors, smoke alarms in all the bedrooms. In some cases, if there's more than 2 floors, we might need the full fire alarm system with the control panel and the call points. And we need the emergency lighting. And normally we need to, we should be doing a fire risk audit as well. So what this means is when we're not going to prepare a house and renovate it as a standard buy to let, and then 1 week before it's ready think, let's operate it as an HMO, because we've got to change a lot of things. But if you do it from the beginning, if for example you're doing a full rewire on a house, then doing the wiring to have smoke alarms in each bedroom, if you're redoing the doors anyway, a fire rated 30-minute fire door from, someone mentioned B&Q, actually we get most of ours from Wix. A fire door costs 85 or 90 pounds, whereas a standard basic door costs 40 or 50 pounds. So it doesn't break the budget to go immediately for fire doors. Obviously the carpentry is a bit more complicated and it needs to be fitted properly. And the same thing for the emergency lights. If it's done at the same time, it's not a big deal. Typically, if we're talking about the additional costs when we're doing a renovation of a, let's say, a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom mid-terraced house, then we might be spending an extra 2,000 maximum on making it compliant to HMO. It's when we get to the bigger ones and when we get into the requirements of the full LD3 fire alarm systems, that there we're immediately adding maybe £4,000 or £5,000 onto the bill. And we're also, as we're getting bigger, we've got the additional requirements of size of kitchen, size of living room, and all this sort of stuff. Whilst we like for 3 or 4 people in an HMO, almost always the size of a standard kitchen is sufficient to meet the needs. But as we're getting bigger, then we have to dig deeper into how many square meters we've got, how many cupboard space we got, and all this sort of stuff. And it can start becoming more complicated, measuring the surface of each bedroom, the surface of the lounge and stuff like that. But it can be a really good way of getting good cash flow. And quite often a strategy that we use is, if we're looking for the cash flow, we might start off as serviced accommodation, see how that goes, and depending on the income, potentially switch to HMO down the line. Or we might do a mixed version. In fact, I do this quite a bit on quite a few of the properties. We've got properties that are done up to HMO standards, and we're renting them out on like 3 or 4 month contracts, quite often to medical staff or contractors. So it's like part service. We've got people in there on serviced accommodation contracts, but we're operating the property as a as an HMO. So then we go on to the next one. What are standard HMOs? So in fact, in reality, we've got mini HMOs, standard HMOs, and then we're not going to talk about this at all. We've got large HMOs. Standard HMOs is 5 or more tenants, but we're still talking about like the standard like buy to let house. So that might be 5, possibly maximum of 6 bedrooms. So advantage is obviously the same, higher income, and disadvantage is higher setup and compliance costs. And and there's also there's more regular inspections that are required in an HMO. When it's a standard let, then the fire smoke alarms have to be checked at the beginning, and then it's the tenant's responsibility to make sure that they're changing batteries or checking things. In the case of an HMO, it's different. It's the landlord responsibility or the agent going in there periodically testing everything, making sure that tenants haven't tampered with the safety things, haven't blocked the fire doors open and stuff like that. Let's pause for 1 or 2 minutes in case of any questions on use of as a house as an HMO.
Yeah, hi Trevor.
Yeah, hi.
You mentioned between service accommodation and HMOs.
Yes.
Yeah, you said you had maybe service accommodation on a 3-4 month contract. So how do you distinguish the rates you will pay for, say, 3-4 month service accommodation type rate and your standard HMO rate?
Generally, what we're doing is we're making our rates a little higher, not massively, because people don't want to pay massively more, maybe like 10-20% more than the standard HMO rate. So if, for example, we look on spare room in our area, people might be able to find a room at, I'm going to quote weekly rates, at maybe £140 a week for but the advert's going to say minimum 6 months. We'll be doing them probably at 160, maybe up to 180 if it's an ensuite room per week. And we're going to be saying short term, okay. And then if someone's asking, or we might put it in the advert, we're doing those rates for a minimum of 4 weeks. So even if someone ends up staying 4, 5, 6 months, it's still going to be those same rates. If they ask, can we do a little something, we might do some small change. And then if someone contacts us, having seen the advert on spare room, and says, so we got our room advertised at, let's say, 175 per week. Someone says, can I stay for just 1 week? Then we'll say, yeah, you're welcome to stay for 1 week, as long as it's like a last minute booking, because we don't want to block the 1 week in 2 months' time, because someone might want to come in there and stay for a longer period. But then it's going to be 25% extra for the because they're what we say, because sometimes that same room, if we're doing a mini HMO on a short, medium term basis, those rooms will also advertise on Airbnb and booking.com.
Okay.
So a room that is 175 per week for a minimum of 4 weeks on spare room, that same room on booking.com might be at 280 or 300 per week. So £40 per night.
Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes what will happen is someone books a room, and it's actually quite common. Someone will book a room for, let's say, 1 week on booking.com because they're moving into an area for work. So they're going to pay £300 for that room. When they're there, obviously, we're taking the deposit, speaking with them. So someone's going to say to them, I hope everything's okay. Are you looking to, I guess you're here for work sort of thing. Are you looking maybe to stay longer? And then we'll immediately propose them before they ask, say, look, if you want to stay for 4 weeks, we can do that room at £200 a week sort of thing. So that is that. Yeah, that's the general approach. And what we might do as well is, if we've got people in short term, we might, and we're in a touristic area, we might arrange so that we've got the complete house sort of free for the June, July, August, for the touristic demand. So we like sort of managing that. And the more that we've got time and that we're looking for cash flow, then the more we might be focusing on those more like specific, let's say, cash flow strategies. And the more that we're doing it for completely passive income, we just want to do it and forget about it, then we're looking either for, we can still do HMOs, but then obviously we're going to be using a managing agent for it and paying the 12 or 15% fee to the management agent. Any other questions before you move on?
Hey Trevor, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you?
Yeah, I just wondered, am I correct in saying you don't need a HMO license if you're letting your property to a social housing provider?
Yes and no. If that social housing provider is renting it out as an HMO on an individual room basis, even though there's one lease, it does require a license.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because once, for example, we were looking at when we had like not so many bookings at one point in time, we contacted the council and said, "Are you interested in renting the house out?" And they, in the end, we didn't, because we managed to, we got bookings again, but they checked whether it had planning
Okay.
and the appropriate licensing. In fact,
Okay.
licensing, it didn't need a license because it's a small HMO, but they
Yeah.
checked all the planning.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Right, so let's get on to the last two possibilities. I'm sure we can think of some more, but these are ones that I'm covering. So social housing. So social housing, we're renting the house generally on a 3 to 5 year lease. It could be to the local council, and they may be using it to accommodate potentially homeless people, or people that need a home. So could be rented out to a housing association or a charity. To, let's say, a little bit more specialized requirements, but still come under social housing, because it's not like the same needs as supported living. One is accommodation for asylum seekers. The main organization doing that is one called Ready Homes, which is part of Clear Springs. So they'll be basically taking a lease on a property for 3 or 5 years and using it to house asylum seekers. So these are like, people call them government-backed contracts, but the lease is not with the government. The lease is with the private company that has the contract with the government. So as long as this private company is, let's say, like a good established one, then there's a relatively small risk of a problem happening. In some cases, there might be relatively new charities or organizations that are saying, and they might potentially be paying more, but there is a question of understanding exactly the same as like a tenant who is backing it. What's the risk of the company or the organization or the charity with whom you're going to be signing a lease on the property? Is there a risk of it? Basically them going into liquidation and not being able to pay. I've never heard of this happening, but obviously it's something still to bear in mind. So we mentioned the asylum seekers. Another one is there's a charity, I've forgotten the name, I think it's called NACRO or something similar to that. And this is quite a big charity, and they're housing people coming out of prison. So ex-offenders which need, so it doesn't come as supported living. Obviously, when there's these people coming in the houses, there are going to be like regular visits, maybe every week, checking everything's okay. Incidentally, if the house is close to a pub or a betting shop, then it's not going to work for these charities. And generally also like for the social housing, there needs to be some sort of community around it. So there needs to be at least shops and some transport links. So there are some like specific requirements. Also on social housing, specifically when it's like ready homes for the asylum seekers, and to a slightly lesser extent the when it's ex-offenders, there's a higher level of finishing that's required on the properties. So that has to be taken into account. It shouldn't, like an HMO, it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be considered from the outset. Yes, we're going to buy a house and we're going to look to get a lease with one of the social housing providers. Typically, what the requirements are is fire doors to protect the exit route. So it doesn't mean fire doors on every bedroom, but if we got a kitchen, of course we got a kitchen. So we're going to have fire doors on the kitchen. If the kitchen goes onto a dining room, a fire door on the dining room, so that the exit route from the stairs is fully protected. And we've also got additional, we don't have to have smoke alarms in every bedroom, but we have to have smoke alarms in the living rooms, corridors, and heat alarm in the kitchen. And then there's going to be maybe some specific requirements on, there's a whole list, but afterwards it's like almost like a snagging list where we've got to make sure we've got appropriate barriers on the windows, levels of the barriers on the stairs are high enough, window restrictors, and lots of little things. And if you've got a garden, which is like on hills behind, appropriate protection for that. But it's not a problem because the social housing providers, they'll come and look at the house, say, look, these are all the requirements, and then we need to factor that in when we're doing the renovation. Typically, when we're doing that, we might be adding between £1,000 and £2,000 on the cost of a standard renovation for a, let's say, a normal long-term let to family. Another advantage of the social housing is that the organisation that is taking the lease on the house will be looking after the repairs and the maintenance throughout the duration of the contract. So it is completely hands-free. The only thing that where the landlord may need to pay are like major things, like if the boiler breaks down, then need to pay for the replacement. But all things that normally the landlord would have to look at after, like plumbing, electrical problems and things like that, is taken care of by the social housing provider. But it's relatively straightforward, and in one of the areas where we operate in South Wales, probably currently, I would say that 60% of the houses that we're finding for investors are going down the social housing route at the moment. So yeah, it can be a good way for regular monthly income, and like sort of forget about it and come back in 5 years' time and see what the value of the house is, potentially refinanced.
All right,
Then-
sure. Can I ask a question then? So
Yep.
how are you doing it? Are you talking to the provider, finding if they got a requirement, you get a time frame and then you provide it, or you just buying it with the hope of being able to let to a social provider at the end of your project?
It's more the second one. So if we've got an investor that says, I'm interested in the social housing route, we know approximately what will work and what won't work.
Okay.
So if it's like some remote area, even though it can work for a family and it might be like a cheap house, we like automatically know that it's not going to work for social housing. If we think it's going to work, then what we're going to do is we're going to, before we propose the house to the investor, we'll make a phone call to the people that we know, our contact in the one of the social housing ones that we think we're appropriate, and we say, we've got this house in this place, do you think it'll be okay? We'll explain like the configuration, because sometimes if like the stairs go into the kitchen, it's going to be a no because of the safety requirements. And yeah, we'll get the local guy to go and have a look at it. And it's not going to be an absolute guarantee, but he'll say, from what I can see, unless there's a change in requirements, this house is going to be fine.
Okay, so you have access to several providers then, because obviously you can't be reliant on one provider, can you?
Yes. I mean, several, it might be 2 or 3. Typically, interestingly, I'm going on about South Wales because that's where we've got quite a lot of stuff. There isn't, the local councils are not doing this system. They're not doing like long-term leases. Sometimes they'll, this is actually going back onto the serviced accommodation thing. We do actually have contacts with some of the councils, and they'll rent properties like for 3 or 4 weeks for emergency accommodation. Typically, it's going to be for children that are in like a difficult situation and they need to be taken somewhere, and there's like 24-hour carers with them. And sometimes we'll get the councils renting directly via Airbnb, but some that know us will give us a call and say, look, have you got a house available for a few weeks in this area? Yeah, so it's so no, what I was going to say, yeah, so typically in this area it's either going to be the asylum seekers or the ex-offenders. So we're contacting the two. One is a private for-profit organization, the one that looks after the asylum seekers, and then the one that looks after the ex-offenders. It's a large charity, obviously. It's government funded, but it's operating on a charitable basis.
Okay,
So
thank
it's
you.
not like hundreds of potential possibilities. It's probably 2 or 3 in any specific area. So there's always a risk at the end that if there's not enough, I'm going to say not enough asylum seekers or requirement, then at the end you might say, sorry, the house is fine, but at the end we're not able to take it. So we should always have that's the aim, but a backup of yeah, it working as standard rental. So let's
Trevor,
go.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you go about finding these providers? Let's say I'm based in London and I want to rent out my property to providers in London. How do I go about finding these providers? Do you use LinkedIn? How do you go about?
Probably, to be honest, you'd yeah, probably looked on LinkedIn or even ask on, for example, the WhatsApp group that we've got. It could be that because obviously there's maybe a dozen people on this call, but there's 80 or 90 people in the group. And I'm in contact with people who do this like more specifically in London. Yeah, so it's a question of asking around. And if we don't know, we'll yeah, maybe have some idea of where to find out. And also at the end of the day, be careful. And always we're saying do proper due diligence. Check who the lease is going to be, what the terms are, and make sure it's fine. And yeah, understand yeah, what potentially would happen if it goes wrong and how to deal with it. The same with everything in reality. So let's move on to the next one. Well, the next one and the last one, supported living. So supported living is different from social housing. Social housing, people are in there and there might be some level of care, but maybe once a week or something like that. Supported living is for individuals, people with specific needs, which could typically would either be physical or mental health challenges. And there it can either be a requirement for round-the-clock carers, in which case it could be a standard house where there's one bedroom that is used by the person that needs the specific support. And then there might be 2 bedrooms that are used alternatively by carers. So the way that this works, it can be complicated, and there are like specialist like people that can help arrange this, but particularly specifically it's like specific organizations that are care providers, and there's also what are called registered care providers, which can then be like subcontracting the actual caring to other organizations. And one of them is like basically taking a lease on the property for 5 years. It can be 10 years. These can be paying higher rates because there's no capping of, it's not like subject to local housing authority maximum rates, for example, for a one person in a 1-bedroom house, for example. It's uncapped because obviously there's specific needs and specific requirements for carers. So yeah, it's something I haven't got direct experience of doing this, but I know it is yeah, people are doing it, and there is quite a big need for supported living. So again, big advantage is everything is completely taken care of. It's medium-term leases. Typically, these leases are indexed with Consumer Price Index, CPI. So they're going up over time. So yeah, it's also following inflation. So if you move on, oh, almost run out of time. So this little table here, it's approximate. So standard tenancies, relatively low yield, but minimum compliance demand. Serviced accommodation, probably one of the highest yielding together with HMOs, but high management effort. Mini HMOs, so using a 2-3 bedroom house, shared house, the large, well, the standard HMOs, and then we've just spoken about social housing and supported living. Supported living also, here it says on compliance demands high, depends on if it's like people that have physical disabilities, then compliance can be quite high, because if it requires disabled access, that might mean larger corridors, adapted rooms, and some properties might not at all work for that. Bungalows, for example, that have got like ramps and quite large corridors will be suitable for that. There's a few more slides on here, but obviously when we've chosen the strategy, we need to understand if the location is right, if you've got the budget to set everything up properly, understanding whether we're going to do self-management or pay someone else to manage it, and making sure we're compliant with the different levels of compliance. And yeah, potentially do a mix across the different strategies as you're building up your portfolios, and yeah, keep up to date with trends, regulations. So yeah, maximizing buy-to-let income, choosing the right strategies. We should, at the end of the day, also, it's like having it correspond with what your personal goals are in property investment. So we've still got a couple of minutes if anyone has a question or something to add, maybe some useful piece of information.
Trevor, hi, it's Vatsal. Firstly, sorry I missed your call earlier. I'll maybe we can have a chat tomorrow.
Yeah.
Just on the social housing, obviously, I'm in the Midlands at the moment, and you know, you hear the news reports about Birmingham Council being bankrupt, and Sandwell and Dudley being close to bankruptcy, and Worcester Council, and so on. So how sustainable is social housing? Because a lot of people seem to be, as you say, going into it. But if you look at some of the providers, they haven't been in operation that long. So, you know, you wonder what sort of capital reserves they've got if the council suddenly decide we can't pay that anymore. So are there any safeguards with regards to social housing, particularly if you're on a long lease, like 5 years?
So I'd say two things. One, from the councils not paying, councils have got the statutory requirements to deal with that. For example, there isn't, I think, a statutory requirement to deal with potholes, and we see the effect of that. So
Yeah.
even though it's putting massive pressure on councils, the social housing budgets, it's a priority, and they have to deal with that in reality, like first. But the second thing that you highlighted, I think, is indeed one of the bigger risks. Some of the, what we say, new kids on the block, looking to, don't like using the word profit, but I'll use it, profit from like operating supported living. And there the question is to understand, potentially take legal advice, because if you're going in for 5 years or 10 years, you need to know what you're doing, and don't just sign on the dotted line. Understand what the lease says about what happens if the provider stops paying, and there should be some provision within the lease to be able to take control, almost a similar thing as like a receivership sort of thing, being able to recuperate the property and recuperate basically the contract for having the direct payment. Yeah, because the council would be paying the care provider or via some intermediary. I don't know exactly how it's working, so that the contract provides that provision to be able to get that income. Incidentally, investment in supported living is also starting to become attractive for institutional investors. And it's possible that, so let's say you bought a buy-to-let, you got a 10-year supported living contract on it with some adequate provider. We call that's got a good strength of covenant. That can, more than the social housing in reality, because social housing can come and go. If we talk about asylum seekers, there can be more or less at a particular point in time. As regards people that need the supported living, that's either a constant or increasing. So some of the institutional investors, pension funds, once these contracts are in place, it's a bit like a commercial project when you bought a commercial property and you managed to get Costa Coffee in there on a 10-year lease, then the value of your property has gone up, and you can potentially sell it on or refinance. So there are institutional investors that are buying even standard buy-to-let properties that have got the supported living leases on them. So we're let's have time for one last question or comment, if anybody has one.
Hey again, Trevor. Again, just a couple of useful pieces of information for people in my brief experience with social housing. Following on from what you were saying about checking the leases, definitely super important, because when I looked at a lease that Serco was offering, for example, so for anybody who doesn't know, Serco is a humongous company that does universal credit, takes care of the prisons, takes care of NHS 111, for example, and things like that. They had a clause in their lease that said something along the lines of the kitchen had to be replaced every 2 years. At the cost of the landlord. So be very, very careful looking for, clauses like that might be in the lease that might sting you. And on the subject of supported living, again, just in case it's useful to anybody looking at getting into supported living, there's a lady called Lisa Brown who you can find very easily on LinkedIn, and she does a podcast And her whole bag is supported living, not social housing, but just supported living. And she offers some very good advice, and like I say, does a podcast on it as well, in case anybody wants any more info on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, and obviously I'm not a specialist in supported living. This is not a specialist education. We don't have a training course, and we're not going to have a training course unless we team up with someone else on supported living. But yeah, need to know it exists, and can be a good opportunity, and do your proper due diligence. Right, well, we're going to close on this. Thank you all for listening. And yeah, the recording is going to be shared probably tomorrow to everyone via the group. And next week, we're going to be looking at joint ventures. So thanks for your time, and have a good evening, everyone.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
See you,
Cheers,
Trevor.
Trevor.
Thank you.